The first time that I ever heard of Franklin George was probably about 1963, 64. He was a native of Bluefield, West Virginia, and was still living there at that time. He moved a couple of three times in the period of time that I've been associated with him. But he would appear in a little publication my dad and I subscribed to back at that time in the early 60s, was the West Virginia Hillbilly magazine. There was a newspaper that was published at Richwood, West Virginia by Jim Comstock. And Jim, who was the editor and publisher, was all the time showcasing the traditional arts of West Virginia and people that were involved, blacksmiths and woodworkers. And I'd see this article about Franklin George and, playing the fiddle here or playing the banjo or the bagpipes. He liked to play the bagpipes a lot. And he played hammered dulcimer and he played the lap dulcimer. And I was getting interested in traditional music. I'd heard it as a kid growing up, and about late 64, I decided about age 14 I wanted to learn to play the banjo. And I'd played the harmonica and the Jew's harp a little bit prior to that, but I wanted to learn the banjo. And so anytime I'd see anything about a particular performer, especially somewhat within my region, that would catch my eye. And I kept reading about Frank, and I'd think, boy, I'd like to meet him, because I'd read these articles and they'd tell about he was at a college playing or at a festival, and I could tell that he loved old-time traditional music, which is what I'd heard. And though I'd heard a lot of bluegrass, I wanted to play old time. And so the first time I actually met him, I said I was reading about him in the early 60s. And in 68, we had a festival here in Summers County at the 1968 at the Pipestem Folklife Center. A fellow that had that center by the name of Don West decided to have a traditional folk music festival. So Franklin George was one of the performers, and that being only about 25 miles from me here, the festival site, I thought, boy, I'm not going to miss that. And it was in the summer months. It was in August. So I was playing guitar and banjo pretty heavily by that point in time. And I went to that festival, and just had a wonderful time, because it was one of the first times that I was ever around a group of musicians. Played, well, there was various music being played. There was blues and all, and old Piedmont and what I call the Piedmont blues style guitar, and there were banjo players and fiddle players there, and Frank was the most prominent of those fiddle players. I really listened to him a lot, and I was playing guitar and banjo with somebody, and I introduced myself to Frank, told him, I lived locally, and he told me that he was also, out of the Bluefield area, which wasn't that far, and he asked me if I'd play with him some, and I remember playing guitar with him. He did a little set there at the festival, and I backed him up on guitar, and through the years, he would return to that festival, and one year, I'll never forget, he brought John Hilt, who was a fine old fiddler from Tannersville, Virginia. Looked just like Santa Claus with a Stetson open road hat. It's exactly what John Hilt looked like. And Frank brought him, and by that time, I got my fiddle mentor out with me from the community here by the name of Landon Jones, and I'll never forget the session. We had, John Hilt had a little Airstream trailer, and Franklin and John Hilt and Landon Jones, who was one of my local mentors, we all sat in that little Airstream trailer, and they swapped tunes and tales. All three of them did, Frank and John Hilt and Landon Jones, and I got to play guitar with all of them. So that was my first introduction around Frank. And then throughout the late 60s and early 70s, Frank would play little venues, and sometimes he'd ask me to play. And Jane, his wife, was always involved with various 4-H functions, and they would play at Pipestem Park. The Pipestem State Park started being developed about 1970, and they had venues, as they yet do, of various types of music, and traditional music was one of those venues. And Frank would come out to Pipestem, and sometimes we would play down at the craft. they had a visitor center there at Pipestem Park, and they then had a very active craft center selling arts and crafts, and the craftsmen would come in and do hands-on demonstrations. And I know Frank through the years would come over and play during an Appalachian weekend or something, and then I would come up and play some guitar and banjo with him. And I remember doing that very well with him.